Welcome to our inaugural webinar for our HEART program. Um, and yes, since it's our inaugural webinar, you're witnessing our we're learning as we're going along, but thanks so much for attending, and we look forward to a great session. Again, I am Stacy Bowe. I'm the training coordinator for the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and I'm here with Ella Weiner, who is our training project assistant, who is providing technical backup. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just to get everyone on the same page, HEART stands for Heritage Emergency and Response Training, which is a week-long program sponsored by the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and hosted by the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Financial support for these webinars is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we are thrilled to have their support as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for the HEART program overall. All right, so next slide, please. So the goal of HEART is to provide realistic hands-on training on damage assessment, rapid documentation, emergency evacuation and salvage, rehousing and storage, crisis communication, and some team building. This five-part webinar series builds upon the in-person HEART program, reinforcing concepts covered in the in-person training by delving more deeply into topics of interest and importance to cultural heritage responders. And as you see here, our first HEART program was held last November in Washington, D.C., and we welcome the graduate class to this webinar. Hi, guys. So glad to have everybody back on the line again. Next slide, please. So just to also give some updates, we've just finished, literally wrapped up everything this past Friday, a HEART Puerto Rico. And here are some pictures from our recent program. We brought the same hands-on training to museum professionals around the territory, and we hope to continue to help with the ongoing work on the island. What was great is that we also had one of our November HEART participants, Soraya Serra Colazzo from the Museo de Arte de Ponce. You'll see in the bottom left picture, Soraya went from being a HEART graduate to a HEART teacher and is demonstrating some proper damaged textile handling. So it's great to see, our graduates evolving after they've received their training. And also I would like to welcome, I believe some of those graduates from HEART Puerto Rico are on the line with us today. Welcome everyone. So glad to have a blended audience today. And for everyone else, whether or not you've participated in this training, we still think that these webinars will be interesting and informative, and we're very happy to share this information. And for those of you who would like to share this information afterwards, when our series is over, we plan to post the webinar recordings on HENTEF's website, which is hosted on the Cultural Rescue's website, and you can go to culturalrescue.si.edu/HENTEF, and HENTEF is spelled HENTF. And again, we can send follow-up emails with all of this information. So that is the conclusion of my welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Ella to talk, to just give a quick technical update and housekeeping. So take it away, Ella.
Hi everyone, so it looks to me as if everyone's in and can hear what we're saying okay. If that's not the case, please reach out to me through the GoToWebinar platform. If you're having trouble even with that, please shoot me an email. My email, which you saw on the first slide, is Weiner, WEINERE, si.edu, and I will help you as best I can to make sure you're hearing everything as smoothly as possible. Also, throughout the presentation, I'm going to be monitoring the question and answer section, so please feel free as we're going through, as you have questions for Bob, I'll be sure to be keeping track and pose them to him as we have breaks in his presentation or at the end. We really recommend that you submit your questions to get as much out of the presentation as possible.
Thanks, Ella. Okay, so now on to the main event. I'm now pleased to introduce today's instructor, Bob Sonderman. Bob was an in-person speaker for our week-long HEART program back in November, and we're very happy to have him serve as our first webinar instructor. Bob serves as the regional curator for the National Capital Region of National Park Service, and he oversees the management of museum collections from National Park Service units in Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and DC. In addition, Bob also is the director of the National Park Service Museum Resource Center, which serves as the central curatorial facility for the National Capital Region of the National Park Service. So take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Lori. Are we good?
Yep, Bob, you just got to press play to show your screen. There you
We're
go,
good.
perfect.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining me today. I delivered a version of this presentation as a paper at last year's annual meeting of the Society of American Archaeologists. And as a former member of their curation committee and the former chair of the curation committee of the Society of Historic Archaeology, I continue to harangue and cajole my archaeological colleagues on the benefits of collections management best practices. My presentation today will seem very Park Service oriented. However, everything I cover will be pertinent and applicable to your own museum experiences. And if you have any burning questions or you want to ask a question, go ahead and type it in for Lori, and I'll try to look at the little tiny screen and respond to your questions as they come through. So it's a little bit seemingly formal, but I think it'll work out just fine. And let's get started. During the past 4 years, the Museum Management Program of the National Park Service, National Capital Region, has overseen the development of 6 park collection management plans, 12 museum security and fire protection surveys, 4 emergency operation plans, which I hope all of your museums have, and a region-wide museum collection storage and facility plan. And all of these documents are critical, and they guide the long-term care of National Park Service museum collections. Similar activities are taking place in other NPS regions to care for the over 120 million objects stored in countless NPS collections facilities across the country. A consistent thread found in all of these plans and our own independent review of NCR Parks, National Capital Region, has revealed a consistent and ever-present theme. NPS museum collections, aka yours, to varying degrees are vulnerable to threats associated with weather-related changes in our climate, sea level rise, and their ancillary impacts. As most of us are aware, one of the primary causes of a long-term climate-related change, I'm not using that other word, is the burning of fossil fuels, such as oil and coal, which emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, primarily in the form of carbon dioxide. Data from NASA, EPA, and NOAA continue to suggest that rising sea level rises due to melting of polar ice caps contribute to greater storm damage. Warming of ocean temperatures are associated with stronger and more frequent storms, additional rainfall leading to flooding and other damage, and an increase in the incidence and severity of wildfires that threaten habitats, homes, and lives. So how do I move the slide? Next slide. I've had the opportunity over the past 10 to 15 years to view firsthand hurricane landfalls from the Gulf of Mexico to New York, and most recently in the Caribbean, that have devastated numerous parks, shattered countless lives, and left billions of dollars in their wake. Although not subjected to the direct impacts from recent hurricanes such as Isabel, Ivan, Katrina, Sandy, Matthew, among others, National Capital Region parks have experienced damage by their collateral damage. These impacts have typically taken the form of flooding along the Potomac and Shenandoah valleys as a result of heavy rains brought on by these events. It is simply a matter of time before a major hurricane strikes right at the heart of the nation's capital. The threat of flooding is perhaps the most observable climate-related impact for all of us in this room. This illustration outlines the jurisdiction of the National Capital Region parks in the states of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and the district. So up in your upper left-hand corner, you'll see, follow my arrow. This is the C&O Canal that runs the entire length of Potomac River right down through the heart of Washington and dumps into Chesapeake Bay. It is our longest park. It's 183 miles of ribbon, and the whole thing is lined with prehistoric Indian sites, historic sites, museum collections, all up and down the river. There's Catoctin. Some of you may recognize Catoctin Mountain Park. That is where Camp David is. Here's Harper's Ferry. Here's Monocacy National Battlefield, Civil War battlefield site. Antietam, another Civil War battlefield site. Here's Manassas National Battlefield in Virginia. This is a Civil War battlefield site. If those of you who are maybe familiar with the Washington metropolitan area, this is Prince William Forest Park, which is right south on 95. It's a beautiful natural park. Piscataway Park right here, and Fort Washington. Fort Washington is one of the largest Civil War era and pre-Civil War era brick fortifications in North America. Piscataway Park, which is right here, is a prehistoric, one gigantic prehistoric Indian site. And if you move to your left on the map, you'll see this is an inset of the District of Columbia. One of the things that I think is most fascinating about our region is if you look at the green, that's all the land that is administered by the National Park Service in the National Capital Region in DC. So fully 20% of the entire area of Washington DC is administered by the Park Service. Another little tidbit, this is Rock Creek Park right here. And Rock Creek Park is one of the oldest designated national parks. It came into the system right after Yellowstone. Here's the National Mall right here. That's important to recognize where that is, and where this is the Potomac River, and this is the Anacostia River. And if you go south, you dump into the Chesapeake Bay. So that's sort of National Capital Region in a nutshell. It may sound like it's impressive because we cover 4 states. We are the tiniest region by far in the National Park Service. You can put all of our acreage in Yellowstone thousands of times. But what we have that they don't have is right here, Washington, D.C. And as a consequence, we have a concentration of resources as well as a concentration of scrutiny. Many of the parks that I'm responsible for are susceptible to flooding. 4 NCR parks in particular are very vulnerable. Those parks are, this is the C&O Canal, which we just mentioned, Great Falls Park, one of the tremendous, this is a beautiful spot right outside the District of Columbia, maybe 20 minutes from downtown. This is what it looks like on a normal day. This is what it looks like on a flooded day. This is the overlook that we're right here. This is the same overlook right here. Think about that. That is some major water. And right here is the visitor center. And I've been to this visitor center. I took this photograph, scared the hell out of me, as we were sandbagging the visitor center to protect the collections. This is Monocacy National Battlefield. Collection spaces are very close to the river. And here's a beautiful aerial shot and a ground level shot of Harper's Ferry National Historic Park. And Harper's Ferry is probably one of our most susceptible parks to flooding. And all of these parks are at risk to rising floodwaters within the Potomac and Shenandoah valleys. Impacts of projected sea level rise will only exacerbate flood concerns for these most vulnerable parks and and many others as well. So here's Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Here's Harper's Ferry right here. Here's Monocacy. These are the 4 that I just mentioned. And right down here is Great Falls, which includes Clara Barton Home, Glen Echo Park. These are all fantastic historic houses and museum collections housed in them. Fortunately, collection, storage, and exhibit spaces in many of my parks, such as Antietam, Catoctin, Manassas, Prince William, and Rock Creek, have very low risk for flooding because they're on high ground. But they have other risks associated with them. Just for future reference, look at the tree canopy here, tree canopy here. We'll get to that a little later in the presentation. These risks are not limited to the painful images of horrific damage as a result of floodwaters due to hurricanes or other weather-related events, but often the threats are much more subtle but equally challenging. Over the past 15 years, I have served as a member of a team or the lead of that team of a group of NPS professionals who are called upon to serve as the cultural resource first responders, if you will, to conduct the initial damage assessments, conduct triage, and provide expert advice to NPS incident commanders. And I think we talked about the incident command team and the incident command structure within FEMA and the National Park Service during our last presentation. And we advise the incident commanders concerning impacts to historic structures, historic landscapes, archaeological sites, and museum collections following a natural or man-made disaster. I've responded to Hurricane Isabel that devastated Jamestown, Hurricane Ivan that heavily damaged Fort Pickens and the Gulf Islands National Seashore, Hurricane Katrina, we all know what happened there, the Gulf oil spill, Hurricane Sandy that tore across New Jersey and New York, several fires, and most recently Hurricane Maria, where teams continue to address the impacts to cultural and natural resources in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. In each of these cases, archaeological sites and museum collections associated with those sites were either damaged or heavily impacted. This is Gulf Islands National Seashore, and this is Fort Pickens. You can see what happened here. The storm surge went over the top of the seawall and just completely inundated all of these structures are on our National Historic Landmarks. This is from a museum storage cabinet from Jamestown after Hurricane Isabel. Sadly, this is on St. John in the Virgin Islands. And this was they refer to it as the Danish warehouse. This is actually where the museum collections and where some of the museum collections were housed for the park. Look at the proximity to the water in this building. This building was completely destroyed. Fortunately, the park staff was able to remove 99.9% of the objects before the hurricane hit. And here's just a little joke for all of us to remember. As we learned after Hurricane Sandy, even though there was very little immediate damage to museum collections at places such as Morristown, Sandy Hook, and Ellis Island, the real threat to museum and archaeological collections in storage and on exhibit was the aftermath of the storm. At Morristown, the Revolutionary War headquarters of George Washington, the primary threat was the loss of power to generate HVAC systems and security systems. But wind-blown damage to trees in close proximity to collection, storage, and exhibit areas was also a major threat. If you can see, look at, this is the headquarters, 1775, 1780s building. Look at this destruction and look how close those trees came to that building. This building right here that I'm highlighting is the collection storage facility. And naturally, the collections were stored in a basement of this building. And this is their archival storage right here. And this collection was a massive collection of archival records associated with the American Revolution. And this is just my one little admonition to all of you when you grow up and you have your own museum. I would highly advise not using electric shelf movers for whatever system you use. Manual systems don't break down and they don't stop during electrical failures. In this particular case, when we arrived, you could see through the cracks in the locked cabinets that the objects were foxing already. And you can see the fans that we set up to try to get air circulated. There was no manual override for this electrical system. So if you insist on having an electrical system, please make sure that it has a manual override. At Sandy Hook National Park in New Jersey, though archaeological sites were heavily impacted and damaged, most of the collections were unscathed through the storm's initial impacts, but the buildings housing the collections experienced critical infrastructure damage that threatened the collections. In other locations, the storm surge heavily impacted resource management records, which naturally were stored in the basement at park headquarters. So this is not an untypical scene for me when I arrive on at a hurricane disaster or a flooding from a river. At Ellis Island, the situation was much the same, though the immediate storm surge wreaked damage on archaeological sites and other parts of the collection, and some parts of the collection. The greatest threat for the Ellis Island collections was the aftermath and the loss of critical infrastructure systems in the park's main storage and exhibit areas, which affected HVAC systems, security systems, and fire suppression systems, leaving the collections vulnerable to mold and water damage. As a consequence, the Ellis Island collections were all moved to the facility I manage, the National Park Service Museum Resource Center in Landover, Maryland, which happens to be well above the 1,000-year floodplain of the nearest river. We sort of joke that if it floods here, we got far more important things to worry about than our collections. These same effects could just as easily have impacted NCR parks, if not for a slight shift in the direction of the hurricane. One of the most significant lessons learned and discussion points following Hurricane Sandy was the wisdom of storing and exhibiting priceless museum collections in areas vulnerable to climate and weather-related events. Nearly 2 decades ago, the National Capital Region embarked on an effort to centralize the storage of our park museum collections, which ultimately led to the creation of the Museum Resource Center, which now serves as a central curatorial facility for the National Park Service National Capital Region. As NCR moved towards centralizing our collections, other Park Service jurisdictions were moving towards a more decentralized model in which park collections not on exhibit were stored at often substandard facilities at individual parks. The folly of this model was sadly exposed after Hurricane Sandy, when so many museum collections at multiple parks in New York and New Jersey were damaged and threatened by a single storm. And here you see the various parks within Northeast region in the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area. All of these locations had museum collections stored in them, and they had separate museum collection storage facilities for each one of these spaces. Most recently, our regional director initiated and provided support for the completion of a region-wide museum collections storage and facilities plan. The #1 prevailing recommendation for that plan is to continue the regional effort to consolidate collection storage at the Museum Resource Center as the best way for us to reduce our climate-related collection vulnerabilities. Now, A plausible argument could be made against centralizing our storage, metaphorically putting all of your collection eggs in one basket. And I get this question a lot. And I counter that by saying, if your basket is really good and the basket is as best it can be, you're in pretty good shape, and you reduce your threats. Jumping back to the parks surrounding the nation's capital, when referring to potential flooding along our major regional rivers, such as the Potomac here and the Anacostia here, and that's the tidal basin right there. When referring to potential flooding along our major rivers, we often hear about the terms 100 and 500-year flood zones. These terms are often confusing and refer to the percentage chance that in any given year, there will be floodwaters that reach a particular elevation above normal water level. For example, a 100-year flood zone means that the area has a 1% chance of flooding to that height during the course of a year. Similarly, the 500-year flood zone refers to a 0.2% chance of flooding to that height in any given year. With the assistance of Stefan Wolke, a GIS wizard supported through a cooperative agreement with the University of Maryland, we have been using GIS data to analyze all NCR parks for flood risks and vulnerability to sea level rise. So if you check this map out, the Jefferson Memorial is an island in a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood. The Lincoln is an island. Look at the city of Washington. This is where the baseball stadium is, right here. This is where my headquarters is, right here. So as you can see from these slides, the character of the nation's capital is going to change dramatically.
Bob, do you have a second for a question?
Sure.
How often do these flood plan designations change?
Well, actually, in the District of Columbia, I think it's U.S. Geological Survey just changed the flood zones for the District of Columbia, which required the city to build a new series of, I guess you would call them levees. There's a new levee at the intersection of 17th and Constitution. You may not notice it, but it's there. That levee system is designed to protect downtown Washington, particularly the museums along Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue. The way the landscape is currently configured, the water will flow right up 17th Street and wrap around to Constitution Avenue. And the design is the levee is designed to hold the water from making that loop onto Constitution Avenue.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of scary, but at the same time, this was designed by the Corps of Engineers and the National Park Service, and it's actually quite inobtrusive. And most folks driving in DC on Constitution Avenue or North Capitol, 17th Street, won't even notice it. It's very gentle on the landscape, but every once in a while you'll see them do practice drills out there. And for those folks that are in the Smithsonian, you certainly can recall we had a major rain event maybe 10 years ago in which the basement of a number of the museums on the mall had water in the basements. National Archives got hammered just from a major rain event in DC.
Interesting. So these 100-year floodplains and 500-year floodplains, do they like where you have marked on the map as in red and in yellow, do those get altered very much, or it's kind of like the projections stay a little steady?
Those are the projections, of course, but at the same time, these are being updated regularly. Obviously, insurance companies are interested in these flood projections, and this is how people get their insurance coverage and things like that. So if you look at that red line, there are like 50 banks within the first loop right here.
Wow.
So these are all kind of scary things, and I think a lot of folks don't think about it that way. But if we had a catastrophic major flood in the District of Columbia as a result of a hurricane tidal surge or something like that, it would be catastrophic.
Mm, gotcha. Well, thank you for answering that question, and thanks to Linda Green for asking.
I'm happy to try to answer that one. It's
Mm,
as scary as it may seem. I try to conjure up images of the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson as islands sometimes, because we have collections in both of them naturally, and they're in the basement, of course.
Of
But they're
course,
being
yeah.
moved. They're being moved.
Actually, if I can interject too, Bob, this is Stacy. I was just curious. So you said that these have been updating. How often are these shared with you, and what's the communication like? Like, are you always included when the next
No,
floodplain? No. Okay. Do you
no,
have to always go
no.
knocking on
I just
doors
sort of
for
have to
this
go look.
information?
I sort of have to go look for that. Um, FEMA can provide a lot of this information for us, and they've been very forthcoming with these, with their projection maps and things like that. So um, I would think they would be your first choice.
hmm
U.S. Geological Survey also produces these types of documents for us. Um, so those are your probably, at least in the DC metropolitan area. I'm sure any of the other metropolitan areas would have this data available to them through FEMA or U.S. Geological Survey.
hmm Um,
If I can, what I can do is I will, after the presentation, I'll try to get links so everyone there can find out from their own jurisdiction who to reach out to get these overlays.
mhm.
Some of the stuff is built, is created by Stefan, but some of the stuff is also available online by the various federal agencies.
Right. Um, Jen Sparenberg, one of our HART participants, also asked that we keep in mind that the FEMA flood insurance rate maps are only based on past events and modeling, and as of yet, they don't include sea level rise or predicted future conditions.
Correct. And we're gonna talk about sea level rise in just a second.
Great.
So, um, so within the Washington metropolitan area, here's DC again, as it currently looks. And sea level rise and climate change related flooding threaten our parks and their collections. So here's some sea level rise action for you. As you can see from these slides, the character of the nation's capital will change dramatically. And you can see the down here on the scale, this is a 6-level sea level rise as projected in 2100. So this is Haynes Point right here. My headquarters is right there. So my headquarters will be an island. If you can see, National Airport is right down here. Pentagon is right over here. Here's the tidal basin up to the Jefferson is going to be Jefferson will be probably surrounded by water at that stage. Baseball stadium, the Nationals baseball stadium is right here. The soccer stadium will be right here. That'll be underwater. So you can see that the 100-year sea level rise in, let's just say 80 years is going to be pretty dramatic. And I don't know if this level of detail is available from all the other federal agencies, but I bet you it is. And I'll try to get citations for all of this for you guys. So Harpers Ferry National Historic Site presents one of the finest examples in the National Park Service of how a park with creative thinking and a robust museum emergency response plan can address and mitigate threats of flood events that are likely to appear more frequently due to changes in our climate. So this is the Shenandoah River, this is the Potomac River, and Harpers Ferry is at the confluence. And if you don't know very much about Harpers Ferry was one of the most important industrial towns in the United States up to about 1840s, 1850s. There are a series of industrial sites here. One of the largest military armories in the United States, next to Springfield Armory, Harpers Ferry Armory, was a contested battleground site during the American Civil War. It changed hands 2 or 3 times, a significant location historically, and it's a big interpretive site for the National Park Service. Perpetually threatened by swollen rivers due to heavy rains and mountain runoff, Harpers Ferry has developed exhibit and storage plant spaces that can be rapidly disassembled when destructive flooding is anticipated. So this is your 100-year floodplain for Harpers Ferry, and this is based again on FEMA maps, and we have museum collections in what is called Lower Town. In each one of these houses, there's a whole series of houses that have either living history, interpretive objects, and or regular cataloged National Park Service museum objects in them. And in the past 10 or 15 years, we have responded to flood events in that park maybe 4 times, and they get threatened virtually every spring, depending on the amount of snow melt or if there's been a major storm upriver. So with that in mind, the park developed these exhibit and storage spaces that can be rapidly disassembled. This highly resilient method to approach a climate-related threat allows the park staff, working within the incident command model, to reduce the threat by moving the collections and the exhibits to safety. More of our parks and perhaps more museums across the country should adopt a similar model. So in this particular case, the exhibits can be removed from the walls with a series of fairly easy, simply with a drill gun. We pack up, here we are packing up all the exhibit stuff right here. Generally speaking, when there's a flood on the Potomac and Shenandoah Valley coming towards Harpers Ferry, U.S. Geological Survey does flood projections and flood stage projections. And normally we would have 2 to 3 days to get geared up. When this comes, when the river swells, it's an all hands on deck operation for the park staff. And what they do is we disassemble the collections, we move everything out, and they put them in these semi-trucks that are staged, and then they're driven up the hill. Harpers Ferry, this is Lower Town. As you can see, these are the historic structures on either side of the main street in Harpers Ferry. And they're driven up ridge to a small little community called Bolivar, where they're hundreds of feet above the floodplain. But these are refrigerated trucks, so the museum collections stay maintained at comfortable temperatures, so they're happy until the flood waters recede and the work can be done to repair the buildings. Though we haven't done it yet, these collections that you see staged, ready to go, they could all be moved to the Museum Resource Center in a heartbeat. So it's fairly easy thing, not easy, but it's a well-maintained, well-planned, well-executed system that the park has implemented here. And the best part about it is they practiced a number of times, but in the last 4 or 5 years, we haven't had major flooding in the downtown Lower Town area. But we've gone through the drill, so most of the park staff knows how this works. So when considering climate related changes or impacts to museum almost said it, impacts to museum collections, we should not be constricted to thinking only about water. Drought, wind, and biological factors should also be considered as potential threats. Although the Mid-Atlantic is not typically susceptible to drought conditions, there are threats to at least 2 National Capital Region park units that leave them vulnerable to the risk of drought-related wildfires. These are Catoctin Mountain Park and Prince William Forest Park. Each of these parks have collections and exhibits facilities in heavily wooded areas. In 1998, for example, a wildfire in Prince William Forest Park threatened the collections housed in the visitor center. Just about a year ago, a wildfire threatened the museum collection storage facility at Everglades National Park, which is obviously in Florida, outside our region, but similar threats exist throughout the country. We've been warned by the climate experts to expect more of these types of threats in the future. Virtually every National Capital Region park is susceptible to the forces of hurricanes and their associated high winds. The roof structures of many of our park facilities are vulnerable to these winds. The increased ferocity of storms could also breed more tornadoes, increasing the threats to structures housing collections. In 2012, a derecho, and if you've never heard that, add that to your lexicon, screamed through the Washington metropolitan area. A derecho is a widespread, long-lived, straight-lined windstorm that is associated with a land-based, fast-moving group of severe thunderstorms. And derechos can cause and create hurricane-force winds, tornadoes, heavy rains, and flash floods. And they can be pretty scary. The 2012 derecho that ravaged Northern Virginia, DC, and Maryland parks, it just slammed our parks. Hundreds, maybe perhaps thousands of trees were downed, and those downed trees damaged park facilities across the region, though fortunately, none of the exhibit or collections facilities were impacted during that storm. Just weeks ago, Prince William Forest Park and much of the DC metropolitan area was struck by a massive windstorm. Hundreds of trees were downed at Prince William, and the park was closed for 2 weeks. Fortunately, the park heeded the warnings in our report and cleared a number of hazarded trees from around the visitor center and their small collection storage area. So this is one of the overlays that Stefan created for Prince William Forest Park, and the red is the tree canopy, of course, and he has high, moderate, and low impact or risk. And if you look at here, this is where the visitor center is, and they've cleared most of the trees around there. But at the curatorial facility, they're right smack dab in the high risk area because there were trees or hazardous trees within the immediate environment of the park, of the collection storage facility. So each of our parks has had this level of information provided to them, and gradually some of this tree work is being done. So our study looked at the tree canopy for every one of our parks, including the collection storage facilities and our park visitor centers. And as with Prince William and Catoctin, many of our parks are beginning to address this concern throughout the region. But as you might guess, we've had a bit of pushback from some of our natural resource colleagues. But for the most part, we're making good progress on removing this type of threat to our collection storage facilities and our exhibit locations. Though NCR, National Capital Region, has not gathered sufficient scientific data, climate scientists have suggested that recent and future warming from climate-related change can and will strongly affect biological systems. Significant disruptions of ecosystems are projected to increase with future climate change. The anecdotal evidence in our own region would suggest that climate-related changes has the potential to impact the types and volumes of insect pests that could affect museum collections. I love this shot. Having a strong integrated pest management plan in place for your museum is critical to its long-term health. Most places have a plan. However, it has been my experience that many don't properly implement their integrated pest management plan. It takes dedicated staff time, and often that is a tough commodity for all of us to come by. I'm very fortunate that I have a dedicated staff person here. Among her other duties, she monitors over hundreds of pest traps throughout our building, and we have it all logged in a database, and we track the location of where certain insects might be. And if we have an outbreak or any kind of potential infestation, we can address it. Another biological agent that can threaten collections is mold growth. Warming temperatures and poorly functioning HVAC systems provide a lethal combination that promotes mold growth that can not only damage museum collections, but the facilities that house them and the staff that maintains them. For those of you that have ever been out on an emergency, you'll know that mold growth can take place within a day, 2 days of when the incident occurs. And for those folks that respond, this can be a serious health threat. So on our team, we typically try to identify those folks that this is one of the cutoff points for members of our team. If you're very susceptible and you're to mold growth in any of its various forms, you typically aren't going to be on the team, because oftentimes when we respond to go, to respond to impacts to museum collections, you've got to be able to go in. And obviously the person on the right-hand side of this slide has a respirator on, and that's really important. But you got to be fit tested for one of those. So not every person who goes out in the field is going to be fit tested. And there are a number of different masks that can be provided that are sort of in between fit testing and then the stupid ones that you see on the street where people they think they're preventing themselves from getting colds. But there are methods by which you can protect yourself. But at the same time, if you're susceptible, you probably should stay away. And mold is a serious issue for a number of our parks. There are at least 2 National Capital Region collection facilities that have poorly maintained. At Harpers Ferry National Historic Park, we had a collection facility that we actually closed last year and removed all the objects because they had a mold bloom in their storage facility. And mold blooms can happen with just a lethal combination of heat, HVAC systems crash, and moisture. So it can be a serious problem, not only for yourself, for the building and the historic structure that the collections are in, and for the collections themselves. And although all of my examples have been from National Park Service units, we're all vulnerable to similar risks and threats everywhere we are. Now, while scientists continue to gather data and do their best to educate a skeptical public about the potential threats of weather-related change and sea level rise, I hope we can all take away from my brief presentation today that why it is important for us to be vigilant in assessing the potential threats to our museum collections wherever they may be. So this sort of wraps up the initial part, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you can fling at me. I love this movie. This is one of those movies in our household. If you're channel surfing and it comes up, we're going to watch it. But even though it's a little bit hokey, the message is clear. If you even see much of the movie takes place in the New York Public Library, where some of the finest museum collections in the world are housed. So that's it for me.
All right, great. We have a few questions that have been coming in from participants, and while you have a chance to think over some of the things that Bob has shared with you, please continue to send questions. Bob is a great resource, and I want to make sure you can take as much advantage as you possibly can. So one of our questions comes from a HART participant named Eric, and he asks, what kind of hazard analysis did you conduct when deciding where to put the Museum Resource Center? Natural hazards only, or technological or human-caused hazards as well?
The answer would be yes. When we actually did a fairly exhaustive search in the Washington metropolitan area, and if you're familiar with Washington, obviously the rental, this facility is a GSA lease, which adds a whole nother dimension to my workload and how we operate this facility. But at the same time, GSA serves as our partner, and they helped us identify a location that, one, met the rental requirements. Obviously that was one of the drivers, but at the same time, it was important for us to have a facility that was way above any local floodplain. We're so far from the Potomac. We're long away from any major potential flood. As I mentioned before, if we had a flood, we'd be there'd be far many more things to worry about than my collections here. So there's that. We also, there were a number of other fairly large warehouse type facilities in the neighborhood, including one of the Smithsonian large storage facilities is just down the street from us. So having available access to reliable energy was important for us. In addition to, we have no trees within the immediate grounds, nothing that could fall on our building. And we don't really have, and we're sort of innocuous out here, so folks don't actually know that we're here. So from a threat standpoint, from like downtown, you have all these monumental buildings and all that kind of stuff that are obviously visible threats. Our building just sort of blends in with all the rest of the warehouse type facilities out here, so we're almost invisible on the map. So those are 3 or 4 of the things that we were trying to look for when we first came to select this location. Did that sort of answer your question, I hope?
I think that sounds good to me. So we have another question from a participant named Sarah, and she asks, given that moving collections is something we try to limit, how was the decision made that this was the best approach to managing flood risk in this situation?
Moving collections?
Mhm.
Yeah. Would I prefer not to move collections? Absolutely. And it just seems endemic in the national park system and other. Well, look at the Smithsonian buildings. They're all in the floodplain. If we had a catastrophic storm surge up the Potomac River, we would all be in big trouble. And moving collections is not your optimum. It just is not. As you all know, the more you move, the more likelihood that you have damage. But at the same time, the example of Harper's Ferry is the risk is so great. I've actually been at Harper's Ferry when water was in the second floor windows of those historic structures. That's 15 feet above existing flood stage. That is amazing. And the amount of damage that could have been done wasn't done because the collections had been moved. And the idea, of course, and things can be damaged. I don't think there's any doubt about it. On the other hand, when we moved the collections from Ellis Island, we moved roughly 1 million objects in 3 weeks. That means disassembling the museum cabinets, wrapping and packing the objects, putting them in containers, getting them to this place in 3 weeks. I'm not sure anybody could have done that, but we did it. Did I want to do it? No. There were just no other alternative. And that's one of the things that helps me when we're out in the field. I have others helping me make these decisions. It's not like we're doing it all alone. We have the National Park Service, the incident command teams, you have FEMA people, you have other folks that are providing expert advice on what are the long-term implications of not moving. So if it's a scary thing. As a hurricane comes, if you're in a position to move, you move. I can give you an example at one of our parks at Gulf Islands National Seashore. Hurricane Ivan struck in 2004, I believe, and the regional curator at the time, a colleague of mine, offered the park to move their park collections prior to the hurricane arriving. And normally you have 5 to 6 days before, to make these kinds of plans before a hurricane actually strikes. And the superintendent said, no, it's okay. We've never been struck by a major hurricane before. And what happened? They got hammered by the hurricane. Their museum collections were completely torched, and they spent millions of dollars repairing the damage, not only to the site, but to the museum collections. So in that case, moving them would have been the right thing to do.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Bob. This is Stacy. So actually going back to Harper's Ferry, quick clarification question for me. So you said that your team disassembles the exhibits in the lower town when kind of you guys give the call, and they're then put onto these trucks and taken away. Did you say that you then take the collection back to the resource center, or do they stay on those trucks?
Well, it depends on the amount of damage. Now,
Mm,
obviously, this is another situation where you've already moved the collections once. Do you want to move them again? And what has happened in my memory is that the damage has been not so significant that you would move the entire collection to the Museum Resource Center. But could we? Yes, we could. Um, in that event, because sometimes the damage is so great to the existing buildings that it could take weeks or a month or months before they can be repaired, so they can, the exhibits can be reinstalled and visitors can come back into the lower town of Harpers Ferry to enjoy the park.
I
But my
see. Oh,
job here, my job here is to figure out ways that I can.
oh, uh-oh, Bob. Have a Uh-oh, Bob, I hope you can still hear me. This is Stacy. We seem to have lost your audio.
Hmm.
Hmm. Although, Ella, are you seeing this? It says that Bob is still talking.
Optimize my storage.
Oh,
Oh, there
there
you
you
go.
are. Oh, okay. Sorry, Bob. We you cut out there for a couple seconds. Oh,
Oh, yeah, he's saying he's having some connection problems.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
It looks like
oh,
we dropped for just a second, but I'm back up.
okay.
Okay,
Okay,
great.
good. See, disasters can come in many shapes and sizes.
That harkens back to the question about what we select this place for, and I guess it's not for internet connectivity.
Gotcha. And then I know I keep asking you about the Harper's Ferry, Bob, but I think it's very
Sure,
applicable to
very.
especially just coming back from Puerto Rico. There's been a lot of talk about potentially putting together a plan of moving collections around the island in the event of another emergency. And I just any more details you can provide, I think, is really helpful to them. For instance,
Sure.
I mean, once you guys kind of started formulating this plan that you were going to, put together trained teams to go into action, I mean, how did that process start? Was this something mandated, or were you the advocate for it, or how did that all start?
Um, for Harper's Ferry, they had experienced so many floods in the past that they were just they had really had no other choice. And part of the issue for them, or one of the good parts about them, is they're a National Park Service unit, and the National Park Service has a very structured incident command team and structure in place, and it goes all the way down to the park level. And it's a huge advantage that we have over maybe municipalities and things like that. So the park staff has already done their hard work, and all they have to do is implement their plan. And everybody should have an emergency operation plan. And if you don't, I can provide some examples of ones that we use in the National Park Service, and you can crib whatever you like. But it's not so much that you have to have the plan, you have to know how to implement the plan. I mean, at some of our parks, where I'm plowing through a wasteland of exhibit cases and resource management records upside down in filing cabinets, you can find the emergency operation plan, but the park just didn't implement it because either they didn't have the manpower or they hadn't practiced. And that's where we all fall behind. We're all so busy in our normal jobs and our normal day-to-day stuff, we don't have time to practice what we really should be practicing, which is the long-term options on how to protect our collections. But I can get into more detail another time, or if somebody has a question, you can provide my email address, or I can just chat with them on the phone. There are a number of things that you can do, but I would recommend that everybody on the phone you can go online and take incident command 100 and 200 and just do that. Just do it. So, and you can implement it in your own museum, even at that level.
Awesome. Okay, Bob, I have another question for you. So one of our former HERT participants, Sorella, would like to know, was the offsite storage a built to suit, or is there anything about the building structure itself that we should be looking for?
Okay, for our facility, there are a couple of things that are really important to have. Um, where can I start? There are a couple of, for me, there are 3 or 4 things that just stand out at our facility that make it a little bit different than other facilities of its type in this general area. Um, we have a heavied up roof to accommodate major snowfall. Not necessarily an issue that you would have in Puerto Rico, but a heavied up roof might be important for a major storm where you'd get a lot of water. So we have a heavied up roof. Another thing that we have in our building is we have what is called an epoxy resin floor. Most facilities of this type are basically a concrete slab, and a concrete slab is like a sponge. It absorbs moisture and expels moisture depending on what the dew point is in the building and outside. And what we opted to do was we poured an epoxy resin material over the entire collection storage space, which sealed the concrete slab. And by sealing the slab, we made our HVAC system very efficient, or much more efficient than it might normally, and it didn't have to fight the ebbs and flow of moisture from the concrete slab. Another thing that we had, and I know that we didn't have in many of our parks in the Caribbean, was operable generators. Now, a generator is fine, but if you don't run your generator once a week to maintain it, and you don't have regular preventative maintenance on your generator, it's not going to be a damn bit of good when you really need it. So for us, we have a generator to the rear of our building that is tested once a week. And it runs for 20 minutes, and I get it regularly tuned up, and I regularly have maintenance on it. It's kind of like a jet engine, and it's loud, but at the same time, it will run my entire facility for 4 days before I need to get gas. Now, that can be an issue in an island situation like St. John, where we had major issues at St. John, where we had a couple of generators that actually worked, but the problem was getting fuel. And you may have to create a situation where you're going to have fuel storage. Fuel storage is scary for people. But those are things you're just going to have to contend with. For me, one of my biggest challenges is making sure my HVAC system in my building can maintain as best as feasible, within parameters, and reduce the rapid fluctuations of heat and humidity in my building. Now, you'll see that, the recommended temperatures are 65, 68 degrees, and relative humidity in the low 40s. Anybody that says they can do that consistently every day is prevaricating. It just doesn't happen. Your job is to try to maintain your building so you can avoid those rapid fluctuations in heat and humidity as best as you can. Sometimes that's realistic, sometimes it's not. So in addition, we have security cameras inside and outside. You all know, most of you museum folks know that 90% of all museum thefts are in-house. And cameras are fine, but cameras are reactive. They typically don't prevent, other than just their presence could make somebody hesitate before they do anything. I certainly am not a big fan of Big Brother, but at the same time, I'm here to protect the collections that we all care about and we all own in our own particular way. And we have cameras on the outside, cameras on the inside. And the other thing that makes our building great is the IPM plan. If you don't have an integrated pest management plan, you better get one, especially in places where you are susceptible to insects, like in the Caribbean. Um, we had we had major problems when I was working down in St. John on the National Park Service units down there. Clear your trees away from your building. We're recommending 75 feet for trees around our museum collection storage spaces and our visitor centers. And we've been pretty lucky with getting parks to try to do that. I mean, obviously it can detract from the bucolic setting, but at the same time, Park Service management sort of gets the notion. What would you rather have, a tree through your roof or the alternative? I hope I answered that one.
Okay, thanks, Bob. We
Perhaps
have
more than you
another.
wanted to hear.
No, I think it's all, I mean, it's scary realities, but these are all excellent tips that we should all be keeping in mind for sure. So we have another question from a participant named Jessica who asks, are other NPS regional offices working on weather-related predictions? If so, is there a plan to share the findings with non-NPS cultural heritage professionals?
I wouldn't dare share it with anybody. Just
Ah,
joking, just joking, just joking. Once Stefan and I have our final report, I think we might be able to share some of it. Some of it would be perhaps privileged information. It might not be available, but I think between Stefan and I, we could probably manage to make it. We can excise the stuff that might be questionable from a park management standpoint, in terms of specific risks like security risks and things like that. But I think we could probably make that available. I mean, I won't be able to do it today or tomorrow, but I think Stefan and I are given a paper at the Society of American Archaeology on a similar type of subject like this, coming up in April. And I think after that, I can work with him and we'll try to streamline the report so you can sort of understand how I'm giving him 90% of the credit. I just had the general idea. And we can share that. And I can make sure, I'm sure that Lori and Stacy and Ella will pester me until I produce it. How's that?
you can always employ some integrated pest management with us.
Right. And we can do that.
All right, so to all the participants, does anybody have any other questions? Speak now or hold your peace till you can email Bob.
You can email me.
Um,
It's
I
just
mean,
Bob
while
underscore
yes,
Sonderman at
Bob,
nps.gov.
and just what you need, more email. But
Right.
no, thanks,
Okay.
Bob. I actually have a question. If while other participants might be thinking about theirs, so Bob, I was curious. So since this is about future weather topics, how do you recommend cultural professionals attending here start to collect data about future weather-related events so that they can use that to help leverage, planning for a next weather event? Like how do you start the data collection process in order to spur the implementation?
Well, I think what I can do is I can work with Stefan and he and I can come up with the sources where you can go to get the direct information, which would provide you some of the flood data and some of
Hmm.
the sea level rise data. I can tell you when I gave a version of this presentation to our park management at a large national capital region gathering, there was a gasp in the room when we shared the overlays that showed our regional headquarters underwater.
I have to admit,
Especially
I
when you're
gasped when you showed Harper's Ferry. Poor Harper's Ferry is
and
going to be toast.
yeah, and because part of folks have very short memories, and even in the southeast where they've been hammered a lot lately, superintendents still go, "Oh, it'll never happen here," or they haven't been around to see it happen. So people have short memories. They need to be reminded that this can happen. And I will do what I can, and you guys can pester me to provide some of that citation information, so the local folks on the webinar can look at their own jurisdictions and at least start with sea level rise and projected flood data for their local jurisdictions. That's a start.
Nope, and that's an important start. No, that's great. And then I guess another final question. Although, yes, please, everyone, if you have more, I hate to be the only one asking, but another question for you, Bob. So you showed those pictures of those rooms, of those flooded basements, that it was just
Yeah.
absolute
Yeah.
chaos down there. Um,
Yep.
any recommendations as a seasoned responder? Like what goes through your mind when you first walk into those spaces? How do you break down the process?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, why did they store all their stuff in the basement? That's the first thing I'm thinking to myself. The second is, you just have to start triaging what you're looking at. Oftentimes, what happens as the first responder, it's been my experience, and I will couch it just by saying it's been my experience that oftentimes um, people from the local jurisdiction are just so completely overwhelmed that they sometimes freeze up and they don't know where to start, or how to even, you just look at it and you just don't even know what the heck to do. You're just so flipped out by the damage. That's why it's nice to have perhaps a more dispassionate, less emotionally involved team to come in, so they can make what theoretically could be more rational decisions. That doesn't mean that the local jurisdictional folks can't provide some insight, but at the same time, many of those decisions have to be made by the curatorial first responders, because the park staff can't even get to the location because of the extent of the damage. In some places, like in the Gulf Islands National Seashore, the only way to get to the park was by water, and you had to take a boat. And if all the boats are damaged, the only way to get there is, you've got a military vehicles or helicopters or stuff like that. That's how we responded. So, and in some cases, we've seen, even on the team, some folks respond better than others to these types of situations. A lot of people don't like to camp. That's just one of the things. They don't like to eat MREs. They don't like to have bugs. These are all things you're going to have to learn to do. And hopefully you can be trained and all of that. And if you're lucky, you'll never have to respond. Would I prefer not to ever go out again? Yes. But is it exciting and adrenaline driven? It is also that. Um, that answer?
Absolutely. Okay, so we have time for
So,
about one
so
or two
when you,
more questions.
okay, go ahead.
So Teresa wants to know, is on a more macro level, is there conversation going on about relocating historic buildings to more secure locations, like to higher ground?
That's a fascinating question. Part of the issue for that is that many of these historic buildings are either National Historic Landmarks, or they're listed on the National Register as as part of a historic district, or a standalone National Register historic structure. For example, so if you take a look at Harpers Ferry, let's go back to Harpers Ferry, that whole lower town area that gets flooded all the damn time, um, the whole place is a National Historic Landmark. The if you move a building, you've taken it out of its historical context, and therefore it can be delisted from the National Register and de-landmarked from the National Historic Landmark. So typically, we don't move the buildings for that very reason. You remove them from the context, the historical context for which they are located, and they lose their value if you move them. Have we moved things before? The National Park Service moved Cape Hatteras Lighthouse maybe 7 or 8 years ago in a monumental effort to protect a National Historic Landmark from the encroaching sea level rise. I'm not using that CC word. And it has been done. But typically we wouldn't do that, though it certainly seems like it might be a logical thing to do. Um, to me, what you want to do is make your collection and make your historic building more resilient. Do you have to have original objects in your museum exhibit all the time? Perhaps this might be a good opportunity for period pieces that aren't specifically associated with the individuals for which these places are famous, or you could have reproductions. Um, those are ways that you can mitigate the impact to the original fabric or the original historic objects associated with these buildings and places.
Thanks, Bob. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so for our final question, which I think is a pretty good wrapping up question, is do you have any recommendations or suggestions about how we convince our institutions that they should put money and time into these kind of efforts? I can see these kind of responses being, well, okay, we've been pretty okay in the past. Do you have any tips?
I think you ought to show them this slide presentation or the slide presentation I showed back in November. Usually, pictures are worth 1,000 words. I mean, you can sit there and talk to somebody until you're blue in the face, but you show them a picture of somebody else's collection is completely trashed and how much money it costs to restore not only the historic structures, but the collections associated with them. That makes believers out of people. And for me, most of our managers know in our region that I'm going to be in their face pretty quick and pretty regular if they're not doing the best that they can do to help maintain their museum objects. And sure, some people just roll their eyes and go, it'll never happen here. But it's the people that say it'll never happen here where they deserve to have it happen. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But you have to be able to be an advocate for your objects and for your collection. And to be an advocate, you have to be informed and you have to be able to show tangible examples of where it has happened in similar locations where people didn't prepare. And that can be a powerful learning tool for the uninitiated.
Gotcha. Okay, thank
And I could
you
go and
so
I'd go and talk to them if you'd like.
much.
And I'd be happy to scare the heck out of them.
That sounds incredible. Okay. Um, Thank you so much, Bob. Stacy, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Ella.
My
This was
pleasure.
great, guys. These are great questions. And as we wrap up, I just want to say that you all who attended today, you'll be receiving a follow-up webinar survey to your email tomorrow, and it just has a few questions on what you thought of today's presentation. We would love your feedback as this is the start of our first webinar series. We definitely want to make them as useful as possible. So thanks in advance for responding to that survey. So please join us for our next webinar, which is next Tuesday on April 3rd with Nick Artem from Heritage Protection Group. The title of the next webinar is Fire, its impact on historic buildings and cultural heritage properties. We are excited about this topic as you can tell, it's primarily focused on fire, which is a difference from our heart training because we've been very primarily focused on water-related disasters. It's definitely been the dominant topic of conversation, but that is not the only disaster that can affect your collection. So looking forward to talking about fire and with Nick next week. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again, Bob. And yes, we will be following up with you and pointing you in the direction of doors to knock down to get some better plans up and running.
All right, everyone, thank you
Very
so
good. It was a
much.
pleasure to be with you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you guys so much, and we will talk to you guys next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.